If there's a party with no photos, no videos, no Instagrams, no Facebook Lives, no Snapchats, no tweets, no texted photos, was there a party at all? This question was asked by technology columnist writer Joanna Stern when she covered the latest technological item that some theaters are starting to use to block the audience from accessing their phones during performances. The smartphone lock pouch, available from the company Yonder, is a lightweight sack that blocks Wi-Fi and cell signals so that the phone won't be a distraction. And this pouch prevents users from accessing the buttons on their phones, thus creating a phone-free event. After the performance is over, the code is sent to the digital pouch so that the phone can be accessed, can be removed, and then people can go on their digital reading, texting, emailing way. The pouch was used at a Guns N' Roses concert, and musicians say they love that the venue made concertgoers put their phones in the pouch. However, not for the reason we might expect. While we might expect that the band liked the pouch because they didn't want their show recorded and shared with others, surprisingly, Guns N' Roses bass guitarist Duff McKagan said he had no problem with the show being recorded. Rather, he liked the technology because people were focused on the performance and even joined with him in singing and having a good time instead of being distracted by their phones. He compared the latest concert with the pouch with a different concert that didn't use the pouch. There's a point where he says he goes down off the stage to mingle with concert goers on the concert hall floor. But when he reached the floor to sing and dance with his fans, instead of encountering interactive fans, he encountered a sea of cell phones that were shoved into his face. He said everyone was more interested in getting the best photo, and with their faces buried in their phones, he observed that they lived their lives through a tiny screen instead of experiencing reality, adding it was distracting and it felt impersonal, especially when he observed that those who weren't recording the event were busy typing an email. Perhaps they were telling their friends about the concert. At any rate, their attention was focused on the phone and not what was truly going on. As I read this article, I was reminded of a worship service I attended in Iona, Scotland, when I was distracted by someone with their cell phone. Yes, their cell phone. At one of the evening services, there was an opportunity to enjoy God's presence in silence. It was similar to a Quaker worship service. And as we began the service, we had scripture and we had prayer, and then the chapel lights were turned off so that the sanctuary was illuminated only by candles. Invited to pray silently for a mere 10 minutes, I watched the light from the candles create a type of living light as the flames flickered, casting orange and brown and yellow light on the stone walls and the stone floor. The room glowed with a golden light, and as the lights flickered, the room ebbed and flowed as though the room were breathing with us. It was rather incredible to see that and to feel that moment. And then about 5 minutes into it, someone in front of me had to get out their phone so that the blue light just destroyed that wonderful view. And the dancing light stopped at that point because the blue light was so much. And the person held the phone in such a way that I could easily see over their shoulder, and they were checking their email messages. I couldn't believe they couldn't go 10 minutes without checking their phone for messages. And then, on top of that, I had a similar experience when we were in a synagogue in Israel this past summer. The Grosse Pointe group and I visited this beautiful synagogue in the city of Svat. And as we entered the quiet space to sit in God's presence, while we sat there, another group joined us, and we were listening to the holy space as it was just sitting there breathing with us. It was a really weird thing. Just note that it was very, very cool to be in that moment. However, in the other group, some adult decided to take out their phone and they began to send a text. That's usually okay, except they had one of those old school phones, so every number was a letter. And so instead of typing on their screen, it was... Seriously? Thankfully, when the text was finally constructed and sent, the person started putting their phone away when, of course, It rang. They answered their phone, and here was a great opportunity to say, I'm in worship, call me later. Oh, nope. They decided to have a conversation. Of course they did. And it was distracting. It was also unbelievable. They couldn't remain focused for at least a few minutes without having to check messages. And then they, of course, allowed us all to hear their wonderful conversation, which we really didn't need to hear about. So, Cal Newport, a computer scientist at Georgetown University and author of the book Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World, claims, get used to this, because this is becoming the new norm. He observed that most of us react to the beeps and buzzes of our phones with great urgency, like parents responding to a baby's cry. Even though we know it isn't healthy or sane, we still do it. Dr. Newport believes that this isn't normal behavior, although it is becoming the norm. And he says we should minimize interruptions, insisting that it's more urgent than people realize. Especially when text and instant messaging guides our lives, it weakens our ability to do things and to do what Newport calls deep work. The type of deep work that requires sustained attention. His examples include writing a report or solving an engineering problem. I would add, staying focused on prayer and being mindful of God's presence. One solution to these distractions, he suggests, is to turn off, mute, or set the phone aside for long periods of time each day. And he proposes not just phones, but also tablets and your computer. The result, he says, would be a life that is richer and more human. He also argues that we ought to consider doing the same with social media websites, because even though we plan on just visiting for a while or just making one comment to someone's post, we usually get stuck in an endless loop of responding and liking things that are posted, constantly saying, just one more. Then 9 posts and 20 likes later, we discover we've become completely distracted from our original plans. And it happens to many of us. Not you, Betty. In our reading of 1 Kings, Elijah was also distracted, although in his case not by a phone or the internet. Instead, he was distracted by fear and by worry. God had instructed Elijah to confront King Ahab and declare that God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, and the God of Isaiah was going to cause a severe drought to fall on the land of Israel because Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him, according to 1 Kings 16. Following Elijah's announcement, God led Elijah to a nearby valley where God provided him with fresh water and food. About a year later, Elijah was instructed to return home and confront Ahab again. But this time, fearful he would be arrested and killed, Elijah fled to Mount Horeb and cowered in a cave. Even though God had provided him security, lodging, food, and water, now Elijah was distracted by fear and worry. Elijah complained to God, and his complaint was similar to the fear experienced by Job, another individual who was distracted by fear. Job experienced a series of terrible disasters, and when the disasters ended, though he remained loyal to God, Job became distracted by his well-meaning friends, and Job began to question God's presence. And he was overwhelmed or distracted by fear. The problem that Elijah and Job experienced was that even though they had faith in God and saw evidence that God blessed them, they became self-obsessed about preserving their lives, uncertain if God would remain with them, even though there's strong evidence that God would not abandon them, and God would keep feeding and caring for them. But their fear distracted them. They were fearful. And they worried that they wouldn't have a home or a place to rest. They worried God was ignoring them, which to me is ironic. Because when they were invited to sit in silence with God, Elijah ran for the hills, while Job surrounded himself with constant noise. And when his friends weren't surrounding him with noise, He made noise with his own voice so he wouldn't be surrounded by silence. So God intervened and distracted their self-loathing as they worried and feared with a great display of power. For Elijah, God interrupted him with a great wind, an earthquake, and a fantastic fire. For Job, God interrupted him with a great whirlwind. Getting their attention, God addressed Job and Elijah. But interestingly, God did not respond to their questions. Instead, God challenged them with new questions that involved deep thinking. They were challenged to consider what it means to be created by God. Job was unable to respond to God's questions, but he remembered that God is God and we humans are not. We are finite beings with limited understanding. Sure, we can gain some wisdom about the universe and how it works, and we can create amazing technology as long as we remember not to let it take over our lives. But God is the amazing creator who laid the foundations of the earth and made a world that can sustain life, all types of life, from the mighty lions to microscopic creatures that float in the air or swim at the bottom of the sea. Elijah, too, was unable to respond to God's questions regarding why he trusted himself more to work miracles than he trusted God, who was the creator of all that exists. Surrounded by sheer silence, it was as though God had placed Job and Elijah inside a smartphone pouch so they'd be free from distractions. Elijah and Job could finally listen to God, and surrounded by sheer silence, their fears ceased to exist. They needed the sheer silence to recall that God has a living relationship with them. And it was in this pouch of silence they were able to listen and follow God's instructions. Like them, we too need this silence. We need the protective pouch of sheer silence to block out the external and internal noise of fear and worry so we are not distracted from God's purposes. Whether it's a building project or new ministries that need to emerge, whether it's a late car payment or an unexpected bill, we need the protective pouch to calm our fears and our worries so we will place our trust in God and not completely trust in ourselves. But the sheer silence allows us to listen to God and move as God moves. Trusting that God, who has been with us in the past and remains with us in the present, we're encouraged by the questions posed to Job and Elijah to trust that God will continue to provide for us into the future. We just need to find that silence and sit with God, even if it's creating a mental pouch or some physical pouch that we need to crawl into. Nonetheless, we need to find the silence where we're free from external and internal distractions. We need to inhale. We need to exhale and find that holy, sheer silence. Mother Teresa reminds us that God cannot be found in the noise and restless. God is the friend of silence. She says we ought to observe nature, the trees, the flowers, the grass. They grow in silence. Look at the stars, the moon, and the sun, and how they move in silence. We need silence to touch our souls. This will allow us to be silent in God's presence so we can hear God's whispers. Silent. We remove ourselves from the crazy stuff that happens around us, where we forget about our work schedules, the dishes in the sink, the shows on Netflix, the problems at home, the meals that need prepared, the text message that still needs sent, or the phone call that vies for our attention. Instead, we just need to be still, surrounded by the mystery and awe of silence, comfortable in a pouch that keeps us free from distractions, so we will not be afraid to sit with God, who provides shelter and security, food, and wholeness. Let us inhale. Exhale. God is waiting for us to be silent.